All right, hey, welcome back. So these are just going to be the wrap-up slides on Hume. I'm going to go through them fairly quick. It's just review, basically. If you have specific questions, you can get in touch with me by email or drop by the Zoom office hours that I will announce on Blackboard. But anyway, by way of wrap-up, the first few sections, hang on here, and there we go, here we go. So, the first section is where he's kind of laying out what he's doing, more or less. That is to say, really trying to step back, take a closer, more critical look at just what's going on in our experience when we're concerned with empirical matters of fact, basically. And to show, okay, there's a certain limitation there. It's going to have some consequences for what's going on. The second one, basically, very fundamental distinction between impressions and ideas. It's not super complicated. It's pretty crucial for any sort of empirical view. These are just Hume's terms, though. The idea, remember, an impression, that's some kind of immediate, right now, present moment experience, perception, that is to say, and the rest are ideas, whatever is not in that immediate sense, basically. And the third one is not so crucial, it's just putting on the table cause and effect being actually one of the important ways in which our ideas are indeed connected, and that's going to be central to what he's doing. Right? You might remember earlier I kind of passed over this, I think, a little bit of a breakdown. You don't have to dwell on this, but it might be useful. You might find this interesting, the breakdown of perceptions into impressions and ideas. Impressions are of those two kinds. That's great. Then you look at ideas, right, how those break down. Because remember, impressions are in the present moment. So anything else, past or future, is going to be an idea. Well, ideas, those are basically just memories. That's fairly straightforward. And then we shift to what he calls imagination. Now, back in the day, people used that term a little bit differently than we mean today. It kind of includes what we mean, and that's pretty much what he says here by fancy. That's one kind of imagination. That's where we really just make stuff up. We're able to do that. We can fabricate things and come up with things that aren't real. But what's really interesting is that when we're really thinking, right, when understanding itself falls under imagination. Basically, all of our experience, all of our direct experience is either happening right now or it happened in the past. So in particular, when we're concerned with matters of fact, right, when we're actually trying to draw out some lesson from past experience about what's going to happen in the future, that's where they fall. That's just an interesting thing to observe for Hume. It's not necessarily controversial, right? But just helps show that there is something, in particular with empirical understanding. It applies to sort of deductive thoughts concerning relations of ideas as well. They all kind of fall under here, basically, deep down. Under what he's terming the imagination. And again, you don't need to dwell on this. You just might find that interesting and help clarify some things. Now, we move on to the all-important section 4, basically. There's this distinction. Hopefully that's not hard. Relations of ideas, basically things that are just defined a certain way, right? They're just defined that way, and they're true, and you can kind of know you're dealing with a relation of idea if, when you deny it, you see, because it's usually clearer when you're dealing with a contradiction. That kind of shows you that what you started with was a relation of ideas. That doesn't apply to matters of fact, right? There's nothing necessarily true or false. It's just an empirical question that we would need to investigate, basically. So don't get confused with the expression matter of fact when we mean that something is true. Because in Hume's sense, you wouldn't say, as a matter of fact, 1 + 1 is 2. You would actually say that's a relation of ideas, right? A matter of fact might be how many siblings you have, 1 or 2 or something like that, some empirical question. It may be this, it may be that. You've got to investigate. But that's what he's interested in, matters of fact, real questions about the concrete world, basically. And you remember, as far as our experience goes, crucial point, we have no direct perceptual experience of cause, of one thing causing another. Our experience is strictly sequential. Things happen in certain sequences. It's only when we step back from that, observe over a period of time certain patterns, where one kind of thing is regularly followed by another, what he calls constant conjunction, only then are we finally clued in that there may be a special connection between those, namely, the first is actually causing the second. So that's really crucial, right? That we have no direct experience of one thing's causing another. We just see that one is regularly followed by another. That's important, very important. So basically this is going to lead then to everything we were talking about inductive inference, when we try on the basis of experience to form an expectation or a prediction about something, right? And remember, we all do this all the time. It's a totally ordinary thing to do. He's just thinking, even though it seems to us make perfectly good sense, and in a certain way it absolutely does, it's not like strictly or purely rational, and the reason for that is we have to make a certain assumption, and the content of that assumption is in effect that a certain cause will always have the same effect. Or if you like, certain set of causes or causal factors will always lead to the same effect. That's the crucial thing. We have to assume that. You can never ever prove that. The only way you can ever prove, or that is to say anything sort of reasonable about matters of fact, is through inductive inference, and each and every time it always rests upon that assumption. When you take that assumption out of the picture, you cease to turn to past experience as a guide, because it would make no sense to do so. It would be completely irrelevant, basically. This can be puzzling in a certain way. Then you can just wonder, well, if we make this assumption, what is it we're doing when we're reasoning on an empirical basis? And basically Hume's answer is, well, what we're really doing is trying to figure out what are the actual causes. Which pattern, say, of constant conjunction, if you like, which pattern does a certain situation fit into? Basically, that's what we're talking about with weather, for example, right? We believe we have a list of relevant causal factors. We try to track them. We try to compare them to past experience to form a good expectation. It's never perfect. And that just tells us that our understanding of what the actual causes are is not perfect. And that has much to do with the fact that our perception never in the first place clues us into what those causes actually are. We have to deal with this limitation, do our best, given that that's our situation. But that's the work that actually goes on, whether it's empirical reasoning in an everyday sense or at a scientific level. That's what's going on. We always assume that. We have to assume that. If we don't, we're lost. We'll never be able to learn anything about how reality works. We have to assume that. Assume there is that underlying regularity, same cause, same effect, and then do our best, given our perceptual limitations, to figure out what the actual causes might be. It'll never be perfect, though, right? Just because our perception is not perfect, basically, we'll always, at some times, be surprised. Our expectations will not come to pass, but that's okay, Hume thinks. It doesn't have to be perfect, right? But we can always try to make it better. So that's the main thing. And this is how we looked at it before. Hopefully, I don't know, you may or may not find this clearer, right? That's generally the kind of reasoning that we do when we generalize from our experience. It only makes sense based on that principle. And the question just is, why would we ever believe that, basically? And then the reasoning, this is exactly as it was before, right? The reasoning basically is, well, it would have to be through inductive inference, but the whole point here is that inductive inference itself only makes sense on the basis of that experience, right? Assumption. That assumption always comes first. It just has to, right? Because if it didn't, then you wouldn't reason empirically, and then you can never prove something like this, which is clearly a matter-of-fact claim. So we just have to accept, Hume thinks, that this is sort of an unprovable assumption. It's an excellent thing to assume. If you have to assume something in life, assuming that the same cause will have the same effect is not a crazy thing to think at all. Nonetheless, it just remains an assumption. It's good to be aware of that. It just makes us more self-consciously aware of what it is we're doing. And basically, Hume thinks this could lead us to less disagreements among ourselves if everybody took this to heart. So there's a little summary of that. I don't necessarily have to go through that, except for the point, the very last point. That's from section 5, where he kind of just fills in the gap and says, well, what is going on? Well, let's just say there is a principle about custom or habit where, this is precisely what we do given our nature, basically, a kind of instinct. And, the wonderful thing about this, depending, you may or may not think so, but that this is something that is not essentially different from non-human animals, or at least a great many of them, and so on. So many people are bothered by that, but Hume wouldn't think that's a good thing. He would think this makes perfect sense, basically, that it's just a feature of our nature, basically, that we do this. That's why we do it. We couldn't really stop if we tried. So section 7 was just where he kind of looked more closely at the idea really of causal necessity. He says necessary connection, that basically amounts to causal necessity, when one thing necessarily brings about another, what's going on in that experience. And just to remind us and to make it very clear that this has something to do with us more than with the nature of reality in and of itself, basically. It's the way we make sense of things. It may or may not directly correspond to how things themselves actually are, basically. And then turning to the last section, this was the stuff about personal identity, which he denies, basically applying that test from meaningfulness. You can try that yourself. This is just supposed to set the stage for thinking about freedom, basically, which he does in this way. Recall, he says, look what I've said about necessity. That's chapter 7, basically, section 7, right? It's this kind of softened up, more skeptical view of necessity. It's not absolute necessity. So he's kind of softened that up. And then what he says here is mainly to say, well, on the side of freedom or voluntary human action, it's not some kind of pure spontaneity or just purely undetermined things. It's just where we determine them, right? Where we or our will is the cause of our actions. And if you think about it, he says, that just means the kind of necessity that he's already described as applying to the rest of reality. So he basically tries to bring those things together, right? Necessity on the one hand, freedom on the other. In the case of human action, they amount to the same thing. So he thinks that's a wonderful thing, and perhaps the single most significant virtue of his skeptical outlook, basically. If he can resolve those debates, then he thinks he's really achieved something. Now, we made a point of saying, well, it's possible that we might think this comes up short in some way, that we might think that's not all we want to say about freedom, that there may be times where what Hume's view is saying is free, say where we act on the basis of an addiction or a phobia or complying with some threatening situation. According to Hume, we're acting perfectly freely. We're forming our will in a certain way and acting on that basis. But it might strike us as misleading to describe those actions as free, basically. So Hume's view might be fine as far as it goes, but perhaps not go far enough. Let me just check. Yes, that's the end of the slides here. That was the wrap-up. Basically, as I say, if you have specific questions, get in touch with me or log in or whatever you say. Tune in to Zoom office hours that I'll announce on Blackboard for this week. There's going to be another set of slides. Some of this stuff won't be and we'll look at it in as much detail as far as the Hume goes, as far as the review for the test. There's a little bit on Descartes, and then there's the Dolbach and the Berkeley. So there's another set of review slides for the test number 2, which you need to do this week before the end. I originally said the 9th, but you can make that the 12th, which I think is next Sunday anyways. As I say, let me know if you have any questions about this.